Can you be sure that Jesus rose from the dead? The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 says that all our faith hinges on this truth, that if Jesus isn't raised from the dead, then what are we even doing? And today, we're going to talk about just how knowable the resurrection is. Well, welcome to FreeThinking Ministries. My name is Josh Klein, and I am your host. And we want to help people reason together by applying logic and sound theology to all aspects of life. Tim Stratton is not with us today, but stick around. We're going to have a guest. We're going to have a good conversation about the resurrection and whether or not it's knowable and why it is pivotal to just the Christian worldview, and not just the Christian worldview, but why it is pivotal to history and how we think about God and how the world works and all of those things. So if you like this sort of conversation, make sure you give this video a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And we've got a great guest here today. You've seen him on this channel before. He's the host of the Cross to Bair podcast. His name is Phil Bair. He studied in philosophy, technology, earth sciences at the University of Iowa, the University of Colorado. He is, by his own accounts, an autodidact and has learned and read a lot and also written a lot. He's written books like Calvin's Desperation, something that Dr. Tim Stratton quotes a lot. Machines Don't Laugh, but that's against naturalism and the denial of free will. And Marx Attacks, which I genuinely enjoy because I hate Marxism. But today we are going to talk about the resurrection and how we can know it. And so without further ado, I want to add Mr. Phil Bair to the stage. Thank you for joining me here today, Phil. It's been a while. It's about time you've been back on the program.
Yeah, thank you. I just zoomed myself out a little bit, so I'm not so scary. But yeah, it's great to be here. I always enjoy our conversations. And as you know, Tim Stratton and I have worked together for a long, long time in various capacities. And so I'm quite at home with FreeThinking Ministries, and this is the organization that I am the most aligned with in terms of my ideology, philosophy, and theology. So this is kind of my favorite place to be, and I kind of call it home in a lot of ways. And so thanks for having me. It's good to be home, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, you can put it that way. That's fine. So for those, I think most of the people who have paid attention to FreeThinking Ministries know who you are, have seen the things that you've written and that you've done. But you've recently published a new book called The Knowable Resurrection. And we've got a cover here for people to look at. It's The Knowable Resurrection. You can find it on Amazon. Just go to Amazon. You can just plug in The Knowable Resurrection and Phil Bair, and it will pop right up. The foreword is by none other than Dr. Craig Blomberg, who, of course, is no slouch when it comes to resurrection arguments and theology and that stuff in his own right. So it's cool to have that forward. I know that you and Dr. Blomberg are close. And there's a lot of literature out on the resurrection, right? I mean, you've got Gary Habermas writing 1,000-page magnum opuses, opusi, I don't know. And then you've got,
Opera.
Yeah. Then you've got Dr. Lacona's massive work. You've got a bunch of other people. N.T. Wright has written a book on it. And you've added your name to an area that has a lot of names added to it. What makes your book different? If people go, well, I've read Lacona's book, why should I pick up Phil's book? What makes your book different from theirs?
Yeah, well, to answer that question, I probably should give you a little bit of a background as to what my faith journey has been like and to why I wrote the book. And when I've been a Christian since I was 13 years old, and I have always believed that the resurrection of Jesus Christ occurred. But for many, many years, it was just really kind of a matter of blind faith for me. And so, and I suspect that it's a matter of blind faith for a lot of Christians. But sometimes Christians will face the same dilemma that I faced, because I read in 1 Corinthians 15 that if the resurrection of Christ did not take place, then my faith is worthless. My faith is dead. And my discipleship is meaningless, and my salvation is probably in question at that point. So, but then on the other side, I hear from a lot of resurrection scholarship that the resurrection probably occurred. And what a lot of resurrection scholarship does is it establishes a high probability for the resurrection. And so those two realizations have been in increasing tension for me for the last probably 5 to 10 years. And as I have become more and more involved in apologetics and theology and debates and discussions and that kind of thing, this tension has become far more intense for me, because I am placing my eternal destiny in the hands of a historical fact that I can only say is probably true. That has bothered me. It's bothered the heck out of me. Because for me, if I'm going to place my eternal destiny, if I'm going to stake my eternal destiny on a historical proposition, that proposition better be pretty solid. And when I hear the word probability, I don't hear the word solid. I hear almost solid. I hear, yeah, it's probably true, probably happened, might not have happened, but probably did. And that's not good enough for me. Now, it may be good enough for a lot of people. And I'm not criticizing existing resurrection scholarship, because it succeeds on its own merits. And what I'm trying to do is, I'm not trying to improve it at the margins. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to ask a different question. Because the resurrection scholarship that I've been used to and that I'm familiar with is about two things. It's about minimal facts, and it's about a cumulative case. And those two add up to a high degree of probability. That's the way that I see this. And like I said before, probability is not enough for me. I need more than probability if I'm going to stake my eternal destiny on something. And so instead of being a cumulative case for the resurrection, I'm approaching it as an eliminative case. And so what I'm doing is I'm eliminating live defeaters for the resurrection. And if you eliminate all the live defeaters for the resurrection, what you are left with is not probability. What you are left with is certainty. And whenever I use the word certainty, I immediately get an explosion of comments where people say, hey, you can't have mathematical Euclidean certainty about the resurrection. You can't have mathematical Cartesian certainty about any historical fact whatsoever, because history by its nature cannot be placed in the category of indisputable fact. And what I argue in the book is that that's a false dichotomy. It's not that we have to choose between probability and Euclidean certainty. There's a third option that I call organic rational certainty. And organic rational certainty is what is arrived at when all of the live defeaters for any given proposition have been eliminated. And so that's what I try to do in the book. So that's what makes my work different. It's discrete from the mainstream scholarship. It's not designed to replace mainstream scholarship. It's designed to augment and complement mainstream scholarship, but it does remain discrete. And so that's what makes it different.
Okay. So you do make a positive case, obviously. One of your positive cases is based on the apostolic record, specifically the apostles and the disciples and their belief that Jesus rose from the dead. And certainly a lot of people have used this angle because it is the most natural place to go And I've used it when I've taught at our theology class. I've taught on the resurrection. One of the first places I go is 1 Corinthians 15 and say, actually, Paul is inviting investigation to this claim. He's saying, hey, there's 500 people. Some of them are dead. But you know what? A lot of them aren't. Go ask them. If you have doubts that Jesus rose from the dead, go talk to them. He was not afraid of investigation. And you say in your book of those people, of Paul, of the disciples, that if the resurrection had not taken place, no one on earth would have known that fact with more certainty than they did. And so it's like I think you call it a comparative epistemic claim. Is that right? That they are in a unique position to have known, and given all of those facts, the way, and it's not framed the same way that some people say it, like, well, they went to their deaths, and persecution proves that they knew it to be true. It's different than that. Why don't you explain what you mean by that, and why that's so important to the hinge of your work?
Yeah, and this actually contributes to my answer to the question, what makes my book different? Because the mainstream literature for the resurrection is based on historical evidentiary platforms. And instead of making a historical case or a probabilistic case, what I'm doing is I'm making an epistemic case. And what I mean by epistemic case is that I am approaching this from the axis of what the apostles knew. And we can deduce what the apostles knew from the historical record. And so the primary central argument of the book, and I'm a little reluctant to share this because now people are going to say, oh, well, I don't have to read the book now, and that's not true, actually. It's very important that you read all the background material for the book. And just as an aside, the reason for that is that the book is divided into three parts. The first part is the establishment of the historical reliability of the record. And I draw heavily upon the work of Dr. Blomberg and on Simon Greenleaf in order to make my case that the record surrounding the apostles and what they claimed is reliable. And because before we can reason about what the apostles knew or didn't know, we have to be able to establish on solid ground whether or not we can know what they knew or didn't know, and we have to establish what the nature of their proclamation was. And so that's why I spend the first 1/3 of the book establishing the reliability of the historical record. Now, there are two kinds of historical claims in the New Testament. There are supernatural claims and there are natural claims. And what I am doing is I am establishing the reliability of the non-supernatural claims. I'm simply establishing the reliability of the natural claims. So one does not have to accept a supernatural worldview in order to establish that these claims are reliable and that we can reason from them from the historical data. That is the whole purpose of the first third of the book, that this historical data is something that we can reason from because it is established well enough. It is established as fact well enough that we can reason from it. And so then I go on to actually begin to reason from that data, but only after having established the data's reliability. And so the central argument is what I call the argument from epistemic incoherence. And when we reason from the data, what we establish is we establish 5 basic facts. And the first one is that the apostles proclaimed a bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ publicly less than 50 days after the crucifixion. Let me say it again. The apostles proclaimed a bodily resurrection that they claimed that they saw and heard, that they are witnesses of, and they made this claim less than 8 weeks after the crucifixion. Secondly, they made this claim in Jerusalem publicly where all of these things occurred, where the crucifixion occurred, where the trial of Christ occurred. They made these claims in Jerusalem in the hearing of the Jews that participated in the trial and the execution of Jesus Christ. So all of these hostile witnesses were there. And the apostles proclaimed these things in front of all of those witnesses, all of those people who were involved in these events. Thirdly, the apostles were absolutely convinced that Jesus Christ had risen from the dead, that they had encountered a bodily resurrection of Christ, that they saw him, they heard him, they touched them, they talked to him. And so I don't know that there are very many respectable scholars in the world who would deny that. In other words, it is well attested fact that the apostles were absolutely convinced that Jesus Christ had risen from the dead. And there are a couple of other facts, and I don't remember what all of them right now off the top of my head. You always forget what you wrote, after a couple of months. But it's important to realize that this proclamation was public. And actually another one of these facts is that over 3,000 people converted to Christianity on the same day that the apostles made this proclamation of the resurrection and claimed they were witnesses of it less than 8 weeks after the crucifixion. So you have the apostles making this proclamation in public in front of all of these people who were actually involved in the trial and execution of Christ. And then, based on that proclamation, over 3,000 people converted to Christianity on the spot. They didn't wait for weeks of deliberation. They didn't weigh evidence for months on end. They didn't sit down and have discussions about it with each other. They heard that proclamation and they converted just like that on the same day. And this was almost instantaneous. I would say that it was within an hour because Peter gets up and he says, "We are witnesses of this. God raised Jesus from the dead and we are witnesses of it." And the response from the people was, "What should we do?" So they were convinced on the spot. And as far as I'm concerned, the only explanation of 3,000 people being convinced that the gospel message was true was because Peter had actually proclaimed and claimed that they saw Jesus Christ risen from the dead, that they are witnesses of this. And they also saw the apostles proclaim these things in the presence of Jews that they knew were involved in the trial and execution of Christ. So all these people witnessed this entire scene, and they witnessed all these conditions. And so the resurrection is the only explanation that all those 3,000 people would convert without deliberating it, without sitting down and pondering it. And so the argument from epistemic incoherence goes like this. If the resurrection did not occur, then the apostles knew it did not occur. And the way we know that is because the apostles were right there in the thick of it. They were witnesses to the execution, the trial. They were there, and they were within that same environment when all of these events took place. But then they proclaimed that the resurrection occurred. If the resurrection did not occur, then they would know that their claims to have experienced the resurrection of Christ, to have personal experiences and contact with Christ alive after the crucifixion, they would have known that those claims were false. And that is extremely, extremely important. So the second premise is the disciples were absolutely convinced that their resurrection claim was true. So the first premise is that the resurrection did not occur. The apostles knew that it did not occur. The second premise is the apostles were absolutely convinced that it did occur. And what I want to do is point out at this point that there's a difference between knowing something and being convinced of something. Because it's possible to be convinced of something that is not true. And if it's not true, you don't know it. So the third premise is it is impossible for a rational agent to be absolutely convinced of something that they know is false. And let me say that again. It is impossible for a rational agent to be absolutely convinced of something that they know is false. So if I know that I didn't drive to the grocery store today, then it would be impossible for me to be convinced that I did drive to the grocery store today, because I know that I didn't. And so since there is this distinction between being convinced and knowing, then this condition where the apostles knew that their claims were false and that they were convinced that their claims were true, that it is impossible for a rational agent to have both of those conditions at the same time. And the next premise in the epistemic incoherence argument is the apostles were rational agents. They were not irrational. They were not insane. But insanity is the only explanation for holding those two in tension. And we know that they were rational because they made coherent arguments, they reasoned with people, and their reasoning actually convinced people that their message was true. And they planned and coordinated their strategies for the proclamation and the spread of the gospel. And so we have plenty of historical data to support the fact that the apostles were rational individuals. And not only that, but all of them were rational individuals. It's not that just one of them was rational and the rest of them were insane. Or it's not that one of them was insane and he managed to convince the rest of them that Jesus had risen from the dead, even though they knew it might not have been true, or they knew it wasn't true. And so the apostles corrected each other, and they reasoned with each other, and they reasoned with their audience. And so all of these things establish that the apostles were rational agents. So if the resurrection didn't occur, the apostles knew it didn't occur. The apostles were convinced that it did occur. And it's impossible to be convinced of something that you know is false. Therefore, they did not know that the resurrection did not occur. Therefore, the resurrection occurred.
Okay, I can think of somebody pushing back and saying, well, I'm not saying that they were crazy or insane or irrational. I'm saying that they knew it didn't occur, and they weren't even convinced that it occurred. They just wanted to convince other people. They wanted a following. They didn't like their falling out, and so they went and did that. Do you touch on that in the book?
Yeah, a little bit, but the problem is that simply denies the premises. And so that's a denial of what has been established from the historical record. If they want to say the apostles didn't know that the resurrection didn't occur, if they want to say that the apostles weren't convinced, then they're staring at historical evidence that differs with them, that is contradicting what they're saying.
Yeah, they have to reinterpret the evidence. Yeah.
Right. They're reinterpreting that. And what they're doing is they're making up an ad hoc explanation that doesn't have any evidentiary support for it. And so I also talk about the methodology by which we eliminate defeaters. And there are three aspects of that methodology. One of them is explanatory scope. The second one is plausibility. And the third one is evidentiary support. In other words, is there historical support for that alternate explanation? And that objection that says they weren't convinced that it was true, they just wanted to convince other people, it has no no support from the historical record. There's no historical data supporting that hypothesis, and it lacks explanatory scope, because if they were not really convinced, then they have to run into what is a mainstream argument. Why were they willing to go to their deaths for something if they weren't convinced that it was true? And it's conceivable that one person might be willing to do that, but it's not conceivable that 12 people are going to be willing to do that. So the explanation is just not a live defeater. And that's what I talk about extensively in the book, is people can come up with something that is conceivably true, but whether something is conceivable and whether or not it's a live hypothesis, whether or not it's a live explanation, are two different things. And what I would call the pushback that you just described, I would call that not a live explanation, because it has no explanatory scope. It's not plausible, and there's no historical evidence that they weren't convinced, because the historical evidence supports the fact that they were convinced. And again, I don't know any serious scholars who actually doubt that claim. This is not a supernatural claim. This is simply a natural observation about what the epistemic state of those apostles was, and that can be established from history.
Yeah, so let's continue to talk about this a little bit, and then we'll get into the methodology of the book and that sort of thing. One of the things that you mentioned in the book is that, like, an unconceived alternative, an unknown defeater is not a defeater. So, like, appealing to atheists do this a lot, where they say, well, we just don't know yet. We'll find out. What would you say to somebody that would say, well, the history of historical inquiry is full of cases where the true explanation wasn't on anyone's list of live options at the time? I think of, like, people used to doubt that David existed because there were the live options of establishing his existence were very few, and then we got evidence. So why isn't that a reason for calibrated humility rather than what I think you call an abdication of reason? So in other words, when somebody says, well, there's an explanation, we're just not sure what it is yet, but we'll get there, how would you respond to that?
Well, first of all, I would respond by saying that is a complete faith answer, isn't it? That's the same answer that I get from atheists when they say, well, someday we will discover how biological life actually appeared on its own for no reason on the planet Earth. And when I confront somebody like that, what I'm doing is I'm confronting somebody who is absolutely committed to the actual idea that there has to be an explanation for something, and that there has to be evidence in order for us to actually embrace it. And so when the atheist tells me, hey, there's an explanation out there, there's a natural law that we just haven't discovered yet, my pushback is, first of all, you believe by faith that some natural law is going to be discovered in the future. And if you do that, then what you're doing is you are contradicting your entire approach to scientific investigation, because atheists will constantly criticize theists for believing things without evidence. But if they believe that some natural law is going to be discovered sometime in the future, they're doing exactly what they criticize the theists for doing. They're believing something by faith without any evidence. And the second one is dovetails off of the first one. Is there any scientific evidence that some natural law is going to be discovered sometime in the future that's going to explain the existence of life and explain the origins and that kind of thing? Well, there is no scientific evidence that something like that is going to be discovered in the future. So again, that's another faith answer. And so I would push back on the person who says there's an explanation for the resurrection. We just don't know what it is yet. It's completely absent from history. We have no idea what it is. And my response to that is not a defeater. That is simply an intellectual vacuum. What you're doing is you're saying, I refuse to accept the conclusions from the evidence, So I'm going to just appeal to something that I don't know, and then I'm going to rely on something that I don't know to get me out of this epistemic trap where I am compelled to believe in something because I don't have any counter evidence against it, and that the evidence for it is so compelling that it's irrational for me to disbelieve it. So what it is, it's not a live defeater, and it's not intellectually honest. What it is it's an evasion of the conclusion of the evidence because you don't want to accept the evidence. And so you're just gonna hold off. You're just gonna say by faith that there's another explanation. We just don't know what it is. So that's not a live defeater.
Yeah, it seems to me that well, there's two things that jump out to me. I think in Stephen Meyer's book, Return of the God Hypothesis, he does a good job of outlining the fact that when you have already decided you're in your presupposition that you cannot consider any supernatural reasons behind anything, then you've cut off a possibility of an explanation without reason. You've just limited the scope of possibilities. And so of course you're going to say, well, science can't, we have to assume that supernatural things aren't involved, and so science is going to discover a different explanation eventually. You're actually just you're dissecting, you're cutting off an entire group of hypotheses with explanatory power that I think are perhaps naturalism would explain it better, but if you're not willing to compare, then we can't find out, right? If you're just deciding to lop that off and say, well, but that's not reasonable. I think
right. And notice what's happening there. What's happening is that they are not dismissing the conclusion based on evidence. They're dismissing their conclusion based on a philosophical bias.
Yeah.
And a philosophical bias is a philosophical bias and a scientific evidence are not the same thing. Philosophical bias can't stand in for evidence. It's a substitute for evidence, and it's simply an epistemic cop-out at that point. So this is the same thing. And Wendell Bird actually made this point in The Origin of Species Revisited that came out in the 80s, and where he documented the weaknesses of Darwinian evolution and the weaknesses of the evidence for Darwinian evolution. And he made the case in his second volume that if you reject any kind of supernatural phenomenon on the basis of your antecedent philosophical predispositions, then what you're doing is you are eliminating an explanation, even if it's true, and you're accepting an alternate explanation, even if it's false, because you're forced to accept it because there's a gatekeeping exercise going on here. Now, you cannot accept, you cannot even entertain the supernaturalistic explanation because we all know in our philosophical predispositions that supernaturalism is that there's no such thing as a supernatural. So that is not a scientific, and it's not a historical principle. It's not a principle in historiography. It's not a principle in the philosophy of science. It is a philosophical bias. And
they'll often accuse people of God of the gaps. Hey, we hope you're enjoying the conversation so far. Hey, please do us a favor. Check and see if you're subscribed. If you're not, a lot of you aren't, but if you're not, please subscribe, hit that notification bell. We'll get back to the episode in just a second, but we can only exist also because of viewers like you, people who support our channel. So you can go to freethinkingministries.com/donate and you can be a part of the team. We'd love to put you on our email list as well. Okay, now back to the conversation. But that's like a scientific method of the gaps where you're choosing a naturalistic framework because you just don't even want to entertain the idea that the supernatural could exist. And sorry to interrupt you there, but I wanted to get this out before I forgot it. And when it comes to the resurrection, I think it's even a bigger deal because it's not just that you are placing your faith in what you don't know and in ignorance or whatever. It's that you're placing your faith in what goes contra the evidence, right? So you actually have to You actually have to place your faith in, well, we'll figure it out eventually. It couldn't be that, even though the evidence points there. So you actually have to dismiss the evidence. It's not the same as believing in something without evidence. It's actually even worse than that. So anyway, I think that you stand on solid ground when you're looking at that. Now, somebody who reads your book, they might think, well, you don't actually engage with like Bart Ehrman or Allison or Ludman or Crossan or Stetcher, or is it Stecker, who Blomberg debated. You don't actually engage with them, so you're not taking their argument seriously. If someone said that to you about your work, I'm not saying it, Phil, because I think I know why you're not actually doing a treatise on their work. But someone might come up and say, well, this isn't serious because you're not engaging with those scholars. Why don't you elide us into why that is?
Well, first of all, the idea that I'm not engaging with those scholars is not actually true. I'm just not engaging with their arguments. I'm not engaging with them by name. But I am engaging with the objections within the various classes and categories that those objections belong to. So I actually am engaging with Bart Ehrman because Bart Ehrman's entire objection to the resurrection is grounded in naturalism. Whenever Bart Ehrman debates somebody on the resurrection, his battle cry throughout the entire debate is resurrections just don't happen. They just don't happen. Why? Because naturalism is assumed. And if you assume naturalism, then you will conclude that resurrections can't happen. And so if you can establish from your philosophical predispositions that resurrections are impossible, then you have defeated the resurrection, because you say what you're saying is that a resurrection couldn't be actual because a resurrection is not possible. And that is the place where a whole lot of these scholars land. And ultimately, that's their argument, and it is ultimately naturalistic. And so it's relying on the exact same philosophical bias that we just addressed a few minutes ago. That's where Bart Ehrman is. And so by addressing the philosophical bias, and by saying that this is selective skepticism, then I actually am engaging those scholars. I'm just not engaging them using their names, but I am engaging them using the classes of their defeaters and the classes of their arguments. And that, by the way, is something that is extremely important, that belongs to the first section of the book, because I not only address the reliability of the record in the first section, I also address a problem that's called selective skepticism. And so it runs like this. And this, by the way, is the class of argumentation that most of the scholars that you just mentioned are in. And that is that the evidence is accepted as reliable if it is opposed to the Christian belief, or is opposed to the resurrection conclusion. But the same evidence, and I mean the same evidence, is considered unreliable if it supports the Christian proclamation. So that's called selective skepticism. And what will happen is you'll see scholars who will take data from the New Testament accounts, and they'll say, okay, see, here's some data here, and if this data is true, and this data actually is opposed to the conclusion that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. So I'll give you an example. There are people who will say that the resurrection didn't occur because the disciples misidentified Jesus, and his face was so disfigured from the crucifixion experience, the beatings and the whippings and that kind of thing, that he would have been unrecognizable. So the disciples could never have recognized Jesus because of the disfigurement of his face. And so that's a defeater for the resurrection. But notice what they're doing. where do they get the idea that his face was disfigured in the first place? They get it from the same historical data that I'm reasoning from. So they're accepting the historical data that leads them to the conclusion that his face was disfigured, but they're rejecting the historical data that leads them to the conclusion that the resurrection occurred, and that they recognized him even though his face might have been disfigured. And so this happens quite a bit. They're reasoning from the data, and they're denying what the data can actually point to, saying is true, but they're assuming that the data is valid whenever they say this is what could not have happened. So they're saying the data doesn't, this could not have happened because of the data, but they're also saying this could have happened, or this did happen, and they're reasoning from the same data. So if they're going to reject the reliability of the record on one side of that equation, they have to reject the reliability of the record on the other side of it, but they don't.
And this is something that's been going on for a really long time in this sort of historical scholarship. I mean, you just look back at Thomas Jefferson, who redid the Bible by physically cutting out all of the miracles and stuff. And I love Thomas Jefferson, awesome guy, brilliant, helped found our nation. But he had a naturalistic, well, more of a deistic commitment, and decided, you know what, these supernatural things, they probably didn't occur, but the rest of the Bible is pretty decent. Neil deGrasse Tyson does the same thing. The Jesus Seminar in the 1980s, John Dominic Crossan, those guys, they did similar things. Excuse me, with the words that Jesus said, by picking and choosing what they felt like, and it really was kind of like a trust me, bro. What they felt like was the most likely things that he said. So it is something that happens in scholarship, and they've got their reasons for it, but they need to lay them out on the table, and I think actually deal with the evidence. And this is why, to me, the debates between people like Mike Licona and Bart Ehrman are interesting and frustrating, because there's kind of two different methodologies for looking at the historical evidence going on between those two.
Exactly.
All right, so here at FreeThinking,
well, let me
go ahead.
One more point here before we. Yeah. And this is an extremely important point, and that is that if you apply the same methodology that these scholars apply to discredit the New Testament, that same methodology discredits all the rest of ancient history. In other words, it actually torpedoes the actual possibility of any historical knowledge at all. Because if you apply this skepticism that they apply to the New Testament to the rest of history, then we can't know that Caesar crossed the Rubicon. We can't know that Alexandria conquered so much of the Mediterranean world. We can't know any of those things, because we're applying the same selective skepticism that they apply to the New Testament. So if the New Testament is not historical, then nothing is historical. And not only that, but they're also torpedoing even modern jurisprudence, because no court in the land sits there and says, hey, it is logically conceivable that this person is not guilty, and so we're going to acquit them on the fact that despite all the evidence that they're guilty, it's logically conceivable that they're not guilty, and so we're going to acquit them based on that. And so no court could ever convict. No historian could ever assert. No scientist could ever even assert, because science is built on testimony just as much as history is, and a lot of scientists don't like that fact, but it's absolutely true. So there's actually two problems with the selective skepticism. One of them is that it is a dishonest application, a selective application of the data, but also it destroys all of historical knowledge altogether. And so I don't think most people realize, if you were to say that to Richard Carrier, oh my gosh, he would just explode, and he would. And same thing with Matt Dillon. If you would bring that point up, because a lot of these people don't understand historiography. And what I tried to do is I tried to make sure that I did understand historiography. And that's why my friendship with Craig Blomberg over the course of 40 years is so valuable, because I learned so much from him about his historical method. And it became very obvious to me that a lot of these scholars are not applying valid historical methods, or they're applying historical method to one set of data, and then they're applying a different set of historical methods to the New Testament. And that is simply not integrity in scholarship.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Okay, so our audience, obviously, FreeThinking Ministries here with Phil Bair. And if you like this conversation so far, why don't you just like the video, for goodness sakes? It's right there. Just hit that thumb, like the video, share this video with somebody who might be a skeptic on the resurrection, and share the book as well, and subscribe to the channel. As far as that goes, obviously, we talk a lot about free will, and we've had you on the show before talking about Calvin's desperation and stuff. And one of the connections that I made with your book is that as you've written the book, you've talked about the apostles were rational agents. Obviously, you've written that book against deterministic Calvinism before. Here's a question I have for you. Does your first argument require libertarian free will? Basically, if the apostles' convictions were exhaustively determined by prior causes, does a rational agent in P4 still do the work you need it to, or do you need libertarian free will to be true?
Well, we do need libertarian free will to be true, but it's not so much that we need it to be true. It's that libertarian free will is required for knowledge to even exist. So it's not a matter of what we need. It's a matter of what the data needs. It's a matter of what the theoretical framework needs. Because if people are going to reject libertarian, if they're going to reject any knowledge that the apostles might have had on the basis of determinism, then what they're doing is they're rejecting all knowledge altogether. And so now they could not even know that the apostles did not know, and that what the apostle did or did not know. They cannot even know that they are reasoning correctly from the data, and that they're reasoning correctly about the apostles. So yeah, it is required. Libertarian free will is a necessary condition for knowledge, and it's a necessary condition for rationality. And Tim Stratton has established that in the strongest way that I've ever seen anybody establish it. So yeah, I would say yes, it's definitely required. But if the skeptic wants to use that as an escape hatch, then what he's done is he has destroyed all of his knowledge as well. And so now everything is off the table. We might as well all go home.
Yeah. So would you say, the free thinking argument, and then as you're looking at the data and the history for the resurrection, those kind of go hand in hand even. I know Tim's kind of made that case about free thinking argument. Now, of course, they're different methodologies, different arguments, but they kind of go hand in glove, I guess, to be able to explain what's happening in the past.
Yeah, definitely. I was in Omaha a few months ago, and Tim and I sat down and we talked about my book, and we talked about my arguments. And it was in a break when Tim was teaching a class, and I was in the class, and I was a guest, and I was kind of kibitzing and being a troublemaker in his class. But I laid out the arguments, and he said, "Phil, what's the argument?" I said, "The argument from epistemic incoherence, that if the resurrection didn't occur, the apostles knew it didn't occur." And he's like, "Yeah, and and the apostles were absolutely convinced that the resurrection occurred." And he's like, "Yep." And I said, "It's impossible for a rational agent to be convinced of something that they know is false." And then Tim guessed the next premise. He said, "I know what you're going to say next. The apostles were rational agents, right?" I said, "Bingo." Yeah. So Tim and I are in the same. We're in the same epistemological corridor here, because Tim is very aware of the rational status of various various figures in history and of philosophers and of just the normal everyday Christian on the street and so on, including the atheists. So Tim is so tuned into these things that it just automatically popped into his head. I know what you're going to say next, Phil. They're rational agents, and we can know that they are rational agents both from history, and once we establish that from the historical data, we can also underline and augment that conclusion with the fact that people are rational agents, and that if they are rational agents, then naturalism is false. And so that also feeds into the idea that if naturalism is false, then no naturalistic explanation for the resurrection can stand. That doesn't prove the resurrection, but it does eliminate defeaters.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. So let's kind of close the loop on this. We started with the difference between your methodology, what you're trying to do, and what people like Lacona and others have done. And somebody might look at what you're saying and they would say, well, it sounds very similar. It's just different verbiage. Maybe a Bayesian would say, you're eliminating the structure that you're doing to eliminate live possibilities, or live defeaters, is all it is. Really is a likelihood comparison with different wording, with different verbiage. So what is the actual difference between all live alternatives are eliminated and a posterior probability of an argument approaching one? Is it just vocabulary, or is there really a substantive difference?
No, I think there's definitely a substantive difference, and we could go into the technical philosophical terminology and all these concepts, and that's not something that you and I are actually. It's not within the scope of our discussion today. But there is a substantial difference between a cumulative case and a case from minimal facts and an epistemic case that eliminates live defeaters. So, but there is some overlap, and I actually mentioned this in the book. It's not that there's no overlap between the two approaches. It's just that there is a discrete difference between the approaches, and that pretty much has to do with eliminating live defeaters. Now, that's not much that a Bayesian is going to be interested in, because a Bayesian is still interested in probability. And so that's kind of where the break occurs. So that, without getting into the technical details very much, we don't want to lose your audience, and it would, and I haven't been prepared. You didn't give me all your questions in advance, so I'm answering these all on the fly.
You're doing a great job, by the way.
But there is a substantial difference between the two, and if we ever wanted to do a follow-up show, we could do that. And because I would like to do a part 2 for this conversation, and invite Tim into the conversation as well.
Yeah.
But the other thing was that Mike Lacona and I have had conversations about this, and I actually had him as a guest on my podcast a couple of months ago, and he was excited about the arguments, and his reaction was, I don't think I've ever heard these specific arguments before, and so when he says that, he said these arguments are different from what I'm used to. To me, I took that as a confirmation, as reinforcing the idea that they do occupy a separate space from the mainstream arguments, even though there is some overlap between the two. And yeah. I wanted to work with Mike more extensively on this, but he has actually changed his course in his ministry, and he's now focusing more on the Gospels themselves in general, and focusing less on the resurrection. So he wouldn't be going in the direction that he's decided to go if he and I were to work together on this, on the resurrection arguments. But I that's okay, because we had a great conversation, and I really enjoyed his approach to the Gospels, and there's a big overlap between his approach to the Gospels historicity and my approach to the reliability of the record that I lay down the case for in the first 1/3 of the book. So yeah, so all these things they fit together, but they're not identical.
Yeah. And I think, to me, and correct me if I'm wrong here, I'll try to simplify it. So this will be a simplified explanation. But to me, I think the difference is what the Bayesian or the minimal facts people will do is they'll take all of the data and they'll say, well, what best explains this? Your approach seems to be, well, let's look at all the defeaters, and if there's one explanation left standing, then it is unreasonable to reject it. You're being irrational if you reject it. So while you might look at the same data and things like that, you're actually gearing towards a different conclusion that you're inviting the reader to. That is the simplistic explanation that I would give. Is that kind of what you would say too, or am I off there?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And my main thrust is that the minimal facts and cumulative case and inference of the best explanation arguments, they get you to the point where you're going to believe it because confidence feels high enough. And what I'm doing is I am eliminating the defeaters one by one, eliminating all the live defeaters one by one based on a rigorous and disciplined methodology until you eliminate those defeaters until doubt becomes irrational, till doubt itself becomes irrational. Because the only thing that can provide a basis for doubt is live defeaters. That's it. That's all. And if you eliminate live defeaters, then you have eliminated doubt. You've eliminated the rationality of doubt. And what you're left with is this other kind of certainty that we're not interested in, because it doesn't have any meaning in this discourse. It doesn't even have any meaning in general life, to be real honest with you. And that is could something be conceivably logically false? And anything can be conceivably false. You can say that it's logically possible that any proposition is false, and it doesn't get you anywhere. It's meaningless. It simply remains in the domain of the abstract, and it doesn't have any relationship with the real world. What we're doing is I am establishing what I call organic rational certainty, and that what that does is it points to the interlocking failures of all live defeaters until doubt is eliminated, and the only thing that's left is that if you are going to reject it, you're going to reject it on a non-rational basis instead of on a rational basis. So I've never liked this inference to the best explanation approach. It's always just kind of rubbed me the wrong way. It's not that it's not valuable. It's not that it doesn't contribute to the scholarship. It's not that it doesn't contribute to the philosophical frameworks, but to me, it has always felt incomplete and inadequate. And that's why I've taken this approach. So, and if you combine the two approaches, by the way.
Yeah, I was just going to say that it seems to me that these two aren't at odds with one another. They bolster each other. And exactly. You can even have a higher degree of confidence in what you believe.
Right. But what I'm making a very bold claim here. What I'm claiming is that what we have goes beyond probability, that we're closing the gap between probability and actual knowledge. Because what happens is that when people arrive at a high degree of probability, what they're doing is they're closing the gap between probability and knowledge with faith. So they're saying probability is going to get me 80% to the finish line, but it doesn't cross the finish line. In order to get to the finish line, I have to shift to faith in order to get me across that finish line. And I consider that unacceptable. And so what I'm claiming, and I know this is a bold claim, and I know I'm going to get a lot of criticism for it, but what I'm claiming is that the resurrection can be known and that we can get all the way to the finish line because of the data. And by the way, my case for the resurrection, it conforms precisely to the actual nature of the apostolic proclamation itself. Because Jesus said, "You are my witnesses." And so the apostolic proclamation was grounded in what the apostles knew to be true. And so when I realized that, I started thinking to myself, well, if the proclamation is essentially epistemological, then our support, our arguments for the resurrection need to be epistemic and not probabilistic, and not just based on historical evidence. They need to be based on epistemology, because that's the only thing that's going to get you to knowledge of the resurrection. And what I wanted to do is I wanted it to be an encouragement for Christians who are struggling with this question, because a lot of people are involved with dialogue with coworkers and friends and family members who are critics of the resurrection, and who doubt the resurrection, and people who believe in the resurrection are just pulverized in these conversations, because it actually does create a certain amount of insecurity. And this whole exercise is designed to give Christians confidence in the resurrection. They don't have to be intimidated by the critic.
That's good. That's good. One more thing, and then we'll get you out of here. Suppose someone says something like this. They say, "Hey, I see what you're doing. I really think it's valuable. I think it's good. But there's just one problem. There are other claims that other religions make, like Mormonism, where they will claim, hey, Joseph Smith knew his vision with the two angels was true. He had witnesses to the fact. They went and witnessed it. They didn't recant. They knew it was true." They're using the same epistemic case that you might use to say that Mormonism would be true, and it was true back then, and it's been, all the things. It's been corrupted. If someone brings that to the case, to bear, no pun intended, what would the response be there? Do we then just compare the claims, and see if they have an equally strong case? Is this something that can be duplicated?
Yeah, no, it is not in the same category at all. First of all, we can aim at the periphery, we can aim at the branches, and then we'll aim at the trunk. Aiming at the branches means that the witnesses did recant, and so a lot of those witnesses came out eventually and said, "No, I didn't see those plates," and originally they said, "I saw them with the eyes of faith." So even that, was not a solid witness. So it was flimsy from the beginning when they said they saw them with the eyes of faith, and then it eventually fell apart completely when eventually those witnesses, the primary witnesses, just all came out and said, "Yeah, we didn't see it." But my case is not that the apostles. I'm not arguing from what the apostles knew was true. I'm arguing from what the apostles knew was not true, if it wasn't true. And so somebody could say, well, Joseph Smith was just absolutely convinced, so we're arguing from his knowledge. Well, you're not really arguing from his knowledge at all. All you're doing is you're arguing from what he was convinced of. And that's a completely separate argument. And what the apostles were convinced of is part of my argument, but it's not the load-bearing beam in my argument. Because if the resurrection did not occur, then the apostles knew that it did not occur. So I'm arguing from what the apostles knew was false, instead of arguing from Joseph Smith as to what he supposedly knew was true. Because no one ever established that he knew that these things were true. All that you can establish from history is that he was convinced that they were true, and the witnesses did not actually confirm it. The witnesses eventually fell apart, and so what he's left with is we're left with a claim of what he claimed to know, but when somebody claims to know something and you don't have solid evidence and you don't have a solid argument that it was true, then what that does is that reduces what he claims to know with simply what he's convinced of.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a fundamental difference between the two.
Hey, great work today. I threw some of those questions that just occurred to me in the middle of thinking. I didn't prep you on any of the questions, and
You're so
clearly
mean.
this was clearly this was a work you've definitely poured your heart and your mind into. And thank you for coming on the program to share it. Hey, if you're watching this, give it a like, as always, subscribe. And also, what do you think of the argument? Is it too bold? Would you rather have a probabilistic understanding of the resurrection? Is it something you're more interested in? If it is, we have a link to the book in the description. Go ahead, click on that. You can purchase it on Amazon. I think I saw that it's actually maybe that might have just been my Amazon discount. I shouldn't say it's on sale. I was looking at the I think it's like $14 on Amazon. Is that right? Let me something like that.
$14.90. I think it's $14.95 for the paperback.
Yeah.
And I think it's $12.95 for the Kindle.
Yeah, so we'll definitely want you to go check that out. I think it's a good book. I haven't finished reading it yet. I want to finish reading it. It's got some interesting arguments that I haven't heard before either. So it's exciting. I know when Tim and I discussed it very briefly, he was excited about especially the arguments that you've brought to bear here.
And by the way, there are actually two more arguments. There's a trilogy of arguments, and what we discussed was really only the first argument. And I could give you a little teaser of the other arguments without actually explaining what they are, but that would maybe inspire people to dig further and to consume the book.
Yeah, let's do that, because I don't want them to get the book for free. But I do think there is more. I did notice the trilogy of arguments. We didn't get to that right now in our conversation. But yeah, give them the tease, and then we'll sign off.
Okay. Well, the teaser is the first argument is the argument from epistemic incoherence. The second argument is what I call the argument from the immediacy of falsifiability. And the third argument is the argument from absolute confidence in public witness. So I'll let those just kind of simmer in the minds of the listeners, and hopefully that will generate enough interest for them to actually get the book and engage with it. And there's a whole lot more that I'm saying about organic rational certainty, and I believe that is an epistemic category that is largely neglected in the philosophical community. And I would like to see more emphasis placed on it, and I would like to see it developed further, because I've developed it to a substantial degree myself, but more work could be done in that area. And I would like to collaborate on people in order to establish this on a more secure foundation. I think it is on a secure foundation, but we can explore it, and I think we can elaborate on it to quite an extent. And I think that it has a lot to do with all sorts of other philosophical and theological topics. So this is something worth pursuing, and I think I'm onto something. That was the first thing that Tim said when I told him about this. He said, "Phil, you're onto something here."
Yeah, I think so too. And I think as I was reading through it too, it is accessible. I mean, it is a little technical in places, but it is accessible. So if you're like, well, I'm not sure about what epistemology, you might have to Google a few words. That's fine. Fine if you're not sure on that stuff. But I think it's accessible, especially the arguments. I think you'll be able to follow them. The falsifiability argument, if I'm recalling it correctly, it's just kind of almost common sense. When it comes to the historical narrative, you go, oh yeah, I thought that myself. Why don't they just do this, right? So
yeah, the immediacy of falsifiability. Yeah. And that, I mean, pretty much what we're saying is that if the resurrection didn't occur, it would have been easily falsified and immediately falsified. And so that's what that argument is all about. But I give you lots more details, and I actually support that idea to a greater extent. And so it is definitely worth reading the book. And I would say, yes, it is accessible. What I try to do always, Josh, is I always try to write my book so that they can be understandable in the intersection between the street and the academy. And I don't want to talk so far above the the average reader that I'm going to lose them, but I don't want it to be at such a low level that the scholar is not going to take it seriously. So I want the scholar can take it seriously, and the average reader can understand it. That's what I strive for. How successful I've been is up to the reader, but I think
Yeah.
you should always talk a little bit above your reader, because that will challenge them, and that will give them something to engage with. So I would say this is for the average Christian with a dictionary.
Yeah. And the other thing about the book as we close here is it's not very long. I mean, it's definitely doable. It's not a 700-page tome like and I love Dr. Lacona, but that Resurrection book is weighty in more than one sense of the word. So your book it's pretty short. So those who struggle with getting through long books, they'll be able to get through this one.
That's the other part of my strategy. It's under 200 pages, and so I try to write books that won't scare people away.
I think you've done a good job. Yeah. Let us know if you got any questions in the comments. Perhaps we'll be able to have Phil back on and we can pepper him with more questions. But you can find him at the Cross to Bear podcast as well. He has plenty of guests on there. I know he's had Dr. Kona on there. You just had someone recently and I didn't watch it yet, but I have it on my list and I can't remember.
I had Dr. Blomberg on recently.
Oh, maybe that was the one. Maybe that was the one. Because I was like, ooh, I want to listen to this one. But I hadn't. It's in my favorites to listen to, and I haven't gotten there yet. So check that out. The Cross to Bear. It's a great podcast as well. Make sure you go there. You subscribe to that channel as well. Subscribe to FreeThinking Ministries. Thank you for joining us. Any departing words, Phil, that you want to give to our audience?
No, other than the channel is actually at Phil Bair on YouTube, and so. But the name of the podcast is The Cross to Bear, but that's not the name of the channel. The name of the channel is just Phil Bair, at Phil Bair. Yeah. And if anyone is interested, all right, if anyone is interested in supporting my ministry, I would invite people to do so. This is always listener supported, and we depend on support from people. And so that's always welcome. And you can maybe put something in the description as to point to do that, possibly, if that's what you want to do. But yeah, thank you for having me on. And this was just a delightful conversation. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. And I'm going to be the guest author on the Atheist and Christian Book Club later this month on the 27th. And so we're going to be discussing my book on the resurrection in that book club session. And so if people are not able or don't have time, are not able to get to the book before they go to the Atheist and Christian Book Club session, where I'll be the guest author and I'll be answering questions, they'll be able to watch this video, and this will give them a good introduction to the book. So it'll be valuable for them if they're not able to actually consume it before that time is occurring. So yeah, this has been extremely beneficial and very valuable, and I'm eternally grateful to you and to Tim and to FreeThinking Ministries. I've worked closely with you guys for a long time, and so I just appreciate this opportunity, and I definitely enjoy this kind of discussion. So.
All right. Yeah, it's been a pleasure on our end as well. Tim sends his greetings. He's off gallivanting around some state somewhere doing something. I don't even know what right now. But he definitely wishes he could be here. Perhaps we'll have you back on after the Atheist Book Club experience to talk about that experience, maybe go through it a little bit. That would be kind of fun.
Sure.
Fun to do as well. Hey, if you're watching this, make sure you give his book a look and be on the lookout for that discussion on August 27th. All right. Thanks for joining us today. God bless. And as we always say, FreeThinking Ministries, stay reasonable.